The shroud is the evidence for the shroud is still up here and not down here. So it could, it still hasn't reached where we can explain, because we can't explain how the image got there, for example.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for all of these episodes. There is some great stuff, and today we've got just as good, if not one of the best, topics coming up, and that has to do with the Jewish burial practices and, of course, everything else related to the Shroud. Today we're speaking with Tom Dallis, and he is a longtime researcher and speaker on the Shroud. And we met out at the St. Louis conference that
Mhm.
took place almost a year ago.
Yeah.
And it was great to get to meet him and get to learn some of his stuff. And then he's written a handful of papers, and he has a really good website. I think it's tomstheology.blog, if
That's
I
right.
have that right. And so in any case, Tom, welcome. It's so good to have you today.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about you. What's your backstory on the Shroud?
Well, you know, I was in college, and when STIRP was getting started and doing the research, um, and I remember because they went over when Pope John Paul I was there, and he died while they were there, and so didn't quite know what they were going to do. And I remember that day vividly, because it was like, wait a moment, we just had him here, and now they're looking for another new pope. So uh, I didn't know anything about STIRP at the time. A few years later, when I went to seminary, I came across some books that were out about the Shroud, and then saw, of course, the magazine articles and all, and that struck my interest. I was never a Shroud skeptic, but I also wasn't one who embraced the Shroud. It was just like, well, if that proves to be true, it'd be a great artifact. But we don't know. And so 1988 came along, and the C14 dating, and so didn't pay it any attention. But then I got involved with Christian apologetics, and that's really the emphasis of my ministry now. And so I looked at all aspects of things that reinforce uh, the truth of the gospel and the resurrection. And of course, it wasn't long before I came across Gary Habermas's book. Of course, he's done all this stuff on the resurrection, and he mentions the shroud. And my background is as an evangelical Christian, and so I thought, well, that's odd. Here's an evangelical supporting what at that time and still today many evangelicals think is a Catholic relic and not something that's given to all Christians. And so I started reading, and I said, okay, this makes sense. And then just started. Then the counter arguments came out with Joe Marino and Sue Benford and all, and read that with Ray Rogers' paper, and I said, well, the shroud isn't as flimsy of an argument as what the skeptics like to make. And today, I still find that when I go online, I'll find shroud skeptics, and their arguments are kind of tiered. They'll start off with something that a shroud supporter said, maybe as an overstatement, or said out of enthusiasm, and then they'll prove how that was wrong, or they'll show a paper or two, that counters that, and then they begin to build their own line of arguments that are just as fallacious, and all. I've had recently. There's one fellow who has a YouTube channel. He's a biblical scholar, and he's also a skeptic, not of just the Shroud, but of all things relating to the New Testament, it seems. And he wrote and was attacking a fellow supporter of the Shroud. The arguments that he was using, they were exactly the same that he was accusing them of. And then he would conclude with things like, we know for a fact that this is a medieval forgery. Okay, how is it you know? That's a statement, a claim, back that up. Where's the evidence? And so that led to me writing about that. But I also, and that's on my website. When you go there, scroll down, you'll find sacred threads, and then that takes you to my papers and then the various blogs I've written on the Shroud. But there was also the argument about the medieval forgery. And so I wrote recently and sent you that copy about that. It's one thing to say, here are the things that make this impossible for it to be from a forgery. But I wanted to ask the why question. Why would a forger do the things that we find in the Shroud, associated with that Shroud? Why would they include that when there would be no need to do that when you're dealing with individuals who, I mean, at that time you had like 2 or 3 heads of John the Baptist, hundreds of splinters of the true cross, animal bones that were passed off as bones of the saints. The amount of evidence that would make a forgery possible was very slim back then. And as we have grown in technology and science and all to bring us to today, what's amazing, and I had that in a recent paper I did, that the Shroud is, the evidence for the Shroud is still up here and not down here. So it could, it still hasn't reached where we can explain, because we can't explain how the image got there, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really liked the paper that we're talking about is Sacred Threads, and I mean you've got so many other ones, but the Sacred Threads, the Shroud of Turin, and scriptural and Jewish context. And one thing that's interesting, I really liked what you put together, and I don't remember how many points it was, but it was like 20 or 30, where you said, well, if this was a forgery, then the forger would have to have done this. If this was a forgery, he would have had to have done this, and he would have had to have
Yes.
captured, dust that and put the dust on the feet and the nose, and he would have had to have, done this with the blood, and he would have had to have been painting which I really like, painting in a totally different way than medieval artists at the time. And, and there is, whatever it was, 20, 30 different points there, and you go, how could and I like what Russ Briault says. He says, if it is a medieval forger, if it is a medieval artifact, then it's more of a miracle than the Shroud is.
Right. Right. There's just too many design coincidences, and we don't mean that by when we talk about that type of coincidence. We mean it in the truest sense of the word, not accidents that happen to match, but something that fits together, that coincides with it. And it's just really interesting that you do have all of those. And I think in that paper, I went ahead and did a Bayesian probability on it and showed that, it would be virtually impossible for an individual to deliberately do everything that we find in the Shroud.
Yeah, exactly. Although I'm not a fan of the probabilities like that. But nevertheless, well, let's talk about the Jewish burial practices. And one thing that you have in your paper, which I really thought was interesting, there's kind of three different dimensions that you have to look at. There's the Jewish burial rites, there's the way that the Romans executed a crucifixion, and then there's the shroud. And it's these three things that somehow have to come together to explain what's on there, and also then try and understand how it got there, and how each of those practices, especially the Roman crucifixion and the Jewish burial rites, and even then the Old Testament burial rites versus the kind of the New Testament burial rites, or the more modern ones, I guess. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I did postgraduate work through the Israel Bible Center, and all my professors there were Messianic Jews. So they knew the Jewish culture, Jewish history, and all. And I figured that was the best place to go. I'd already received a master's and my doctorate in divinity or in theology, and so I wanted to learn more about Jewish culture, and all of them. I mean, they would explain things, and it's amazing how many of them closet shroudies. They because they recognize that this agrees with what we find in the New Testament and with the ancient Israel. Jews practiced what they would do is when someone would die, you hear the phrase that they were gathered to their fathers. We find that in the Old Testament, for example. Well, that's because their bones and all, they were put together. So they wanted to gather those things together. Now, throughout Israel's history, they had a variety of ways that they buried people. Sometimes they would bury them in a cave. In some places, they would bury them in the ground, sometimes facing downward, sometimes facing upward, sometimes in a fetal position. We find examples of this sites through Qumran and the Nabateans and others. We have been able to I think it was Rachel, her name just escaped me. Anyway, she wrote it's kind of the founding to go back and see all of the burial practices that they had in ancient Israel. During the first century AD, just a little bit before and all the way up to 70 AD, so for about 100 years in Jerusalem and also at Jericho, we had the Jews practice what was called a second burial. So a person would die, they would take their body and put it in a cave or in a tomb. They would wrap it in a shroud. They did not mummify them. Jews, the only ones that we have that were mummified or used embalming were those that came out of Egypt, like Joseph. And that would be, to be expected. But during that, and even during that time in the first century in Egypt, they weren't mummifying corpses. So they would just have a loose cloth around them, and then they would bind that cloth. They would bind them so that to show some respect, like the jaw and the hands and the feet, so that as rigor mortis set in, that they would be, as it were, laid out. But they also practiced, and a Jewish thought was that as a person decayed, that they were atoning for their sins. So any sin that you might have, you're atoning for that, and you felt everything through the body's decaying. And then a year later, the oldest son or close family member would go in and gather up the bones and put them in these ossuary boxes. And it wasn't until like the 1950s or so that we began discovering all these ossuary boxes in Israel. And in the 90s, I think it was, when they were building a water park, they found one, and they had it was really ornate, and it had an inscription on it that said Caiaphas. So here we had the chief priest who was responsible during the crucifixion of Christ, and we have his bone box and his bones. So they would put all of those in, and they would gather family members and share that bone box, and then would put them all in these little niches throughout Israel. So that fits because when Christ dies and is buried, Joseph of Arimathea gets a shroud. We're told that plainly in the Gospels. And Nicodemus goes and gets 75 pounds of spices. Spices were not used, again, to embalm. Jews didn't embalm. The spices were used to cover up the stench of decay. Just like we send flowers. So if you had that amount of spices, that's what you would have for like a king. So they were having a royal treat. And personal, this I can't prove this. This is just a theory. I think that's why there's no side image on the shroud. I think that the spices were in little packets, little bags were laid along the side, and then that also would be part of the Athonia. When John looks in and sees the cloths, you would have the spice cloths, you would have the Sudarium, you would have any binding cloth, maybe that strip off the side of the shroud, perhaps. I do think Dr. Jackson is correct in that, that it came off, but, I wasn't there. I'm old, but I'm not that old. And, and all,
Well,
but
so
they would have
you're thinking that the spice was inside the shroud,
along the
inside the
sides.
but
And
along the sides of the body, touching the body, and then the cloth was outside of that.
yes, yes, right. It'd come over the head and around, and it wasn't completely bound because two things: Jesus died a horrible, bloody death, and so for the Jews, the life of the flesh is in the blood. So the blood had to be buried with them, and so that would be why they would also put that Sudarium over his face as they would carry him to catch any of the bodily fluids that would come out of the mouth and nose from a dead body. They would take him. They only had about 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours. Of, I mean, remember he dies at 3 o'clock. Joseph has to go and get permission from a pilot. Pilot checks to make sure that he's dead. In the meantime, they're breaking the legs of the others. They go over and they see that Jesus is dead. They put the spear in his side. Joseph comes back. He may have been there during that. We don't know, but we do know that had to take place. Then they would get that Sudarium, that face cloth, and put around him so you wouldn't see that. It'd catch all of that fluid, and they would take him to the tomb and lay him in the tomb. Normally, a body is washed, but one that has gone through this kind of turmoil would not be, and they didn't have time. They certainly didn't have time to wrap him like a mummy, and they didn't have time to wash the body. I don't think the body was washed. I think it was laid in the tomb unwashed, and the women that were coming on Sunday morning would have washed the body and put more spices around, brought what they had. But there was no need.
Yeah, well, I'm going to push back a little bit on the
Okay.
washing of the body. Personally, up until really literally up until a day or two ago, I was thinking that yes, the body was, or no, the body was not washed. And primarily because there was dust on the nose and dust on the knees and dust on the feet. And so that dust would be an indication that that the body was not washed. Now, on the flip side, though, is that there are all of these scourge wounds, and all of the scourge wounds. If Jesus is then hanging on the cross, at least some of those scourge wounds had to have broken the skin. And if they had broken the skin, then certainly there would have been droplets of blood coming out of those wounds where where the skin was broken. And so this is my line of thinking, and maybe you've got some other thoughts there. So then he gets taken down from the cross. He gets put into the tomb, and then he's wrapped with the shroud. And there are no droplets of blood there's no evidence of droplets of blood around any of the scourge marks. The scourge marks are kind of, they kind of show that there was a and something that happened to the skin there, but there's no droplets of blood blood, or even maybe a stream of blood that might have, taken place. So what I was thinking is, and I was talking to Teddy Pappas by email, and we were thinking, well, maybe if that's the case, then maybe what they did was they tried to wipe up the blood from each one of those things because they needed to keep the blood with the body, and so they wiped up the blood, and that is at least a partial cleaning. So they were not necessarily cleaning the body, maybe, and maybe that's then, how to define this. They weren't necessarily cleaning the body. They were just collecting the blood that was there. And the reason why I say not necessarily cleaning the body is because there's still dust on the nose and dust on the knees and dust on the feet. Didn't know if you had any thoughts along those lines.
Well, I do know that dead bodies do bleed, but they don't bleed like living bodies do, because the heart is not pumping blood through the veins and all. And a lot of those wounds, if not all of those wounds, could have dried during the time where he is on the cross. We do know that there's blood flow from that's on the arms, and I want to come back to that and all. But the fact that there's blood flowing marks on the arms tells me also the body had not been properly washed, in addition to the dirt on the feet and on the nose. That, I think, speaks in favor of it not being a forgery, because a forger needs to do two things. He needs to make it convincing, and he needs not to upset the apple cart. He doesn't want to put things in there that will draw attention to his forgery if it's a forgery. And the blood coming down like the one arm here and then straight down, as it were, here, I think Dr. Gilbert Lavoie has it correct when he and John Jackson did redid those the crucifixions with some volunteers. And if anyone's wondering, no, they weren't actually nailed, but they were volunteered to let fluid come down and see how it was. But Lavoie has it like this kind of matches how he was. Now, we always think of Romans crucifying somebody like this, and they did, but Romans, and we know this from Cicero, we know this from Josephus, that they would crucify individuals in a variety of ways. Sometimes like this, sometimes like this. It's really whatever they wanted to at that time, or to humiliate. I mean, that's really what crucifixion is about: prolonging death and humiliation. So I think that we have blood coming down here, and all. I think that has a lot to do with it. I know that we really draw a lot from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, and I think that is a great film. And as a former filmmaker myself, I think Mel Gibson did a great job. But I think that was probably overstatement. I think you had more bruising with that than you had the ripping and massive things. We do say that, but the question is what that usually killed them right then. And Pilate did not want him to be dead. Remember, after he had scourged him, he brought him and said, "Behold the man." We want, and he thought the crowd would release him and that would be enough. But instead, they asked for Barabbas. So that all plays into it. So I think that you had more bruising, some open wounds, but those could be dried, or also remember, you have to get from the cross to the tomb. So there very well could have been, for the lack of a better word, a stretcher, a piece of cloth where the body could be laid. The Sudarium, we've covered the face, we've lowered him, we've covered the body, we take him out to the tomb, but this has more blood on it, and it's rolled up and put off to the side as well. There's another cloth, if that's possible. I cannot prove that. It just seems to fit with what would happen. And I do know that they did not want to wash away, because you're washing away the blood, and they should be buried with the blood. That's why Jews today don't embalm and are buried within 24 hours.
Yeah, no, and you make some good points in terms of, well, if what I had talked about is that there were some drops of blood and they cleaned those up in some fashion, then why didn't they clean up the ones on the arms? And then why didn't they clean up the ones on the hair, on the head from the crown of thorns? You probably couldn't have cleaned up certainly the amount of blood that was coming out of the side. And so, that was just too much. And then they also, there's also evidence of blood, coming out the nose and out of the mouth as well. So that maybe that was from the, just, it was just continuing to come, and they couldn't figure out how to stop it, or they ran out of time, and they were rushing around trying to get everything done, and they weren't able to do it, so they were going to come back on the Sunday morning to complete the burial.
Well, if the Sudarium of Oviedo is the actual Sudarium, and I think it is, look at how much blood is on that compared to the shroud. And that's just from the face wounds and drainage and all. But that gives you a good contrast. But they did have to carry the body. It may not have been very far, but they still had to carry that body. Now, I don't think Joseph and Nicodemus carried the body. I think that they had servants, and they let them carry the body because they were still Jewish priests, and they were going into the Sabbath. And all. But that fits.
Exactly.
That seems to fit that category. There seems to me that there's more things that say for the authenticity of the shroud. The Jewish burial practices, I think, is a strong candidate for it. Once we do away with the two arguments that skeptics have against the shroud, the carbon-14 dating and the Darcy memorandum. I think that the Darcy memorandum is easily dismissed. That's hearsay. And Clement had come back and said, I want you to venerate the shroud. So that doesn't seem to line up. I think that that's easily disproven. And the C14, while it is very important, there are a number of things to remember. One is that linen is not the best candidate for carbon-14 dating because of the characteristics of the linen itself. And certainly linen that comes out of the ground or out of a pot that's been hidden for 2,000 years is a much better candidate than linen that has been exposed to fires, been exposed to incense, handled, and all. And I think Ray Rogers, you've got that with the invisible weaving. I know some people question that, but still, a chemist, and he knew that there was special gum and all that was on that shroud. Plus, he had samples that actually predate from the raised corner and all that. He could compare those two. He had firsthand exposure to it. So I think those two things. Then I think that Bob Rucker's argument on radiation and that type of light is an extremely good argument that would definitely throw off the C14 dating. So, and then we have 5 other tests that put it into the 1st century. So all those things together. But that's why I wrote this most recent blog about forgery, because a forger would not do some of the things that we find in the shroud. Why would he make it a positive negative so that the negative is a positive? There would be no reason for that. It's definitely something. I know some have argued that maybe it was paint and the paint fell off, But if that were the case, you'd still have binder and residue. And Stirp showed that it was not a painting. It was not a product of an artist. So that's this, that can easily be dismissed scientifically. Why would a forger put blood on the shroud prior to the image? That doesn't make sense. Why would he do something? As I said, he would have put it like this, so the blood was coming down this way. To have it like this, so the blood's coming this way, is an argument that for the shroud, because a forger would not have done this. He would have done like what we find in all other crucifixion pictures. Same way with the helmet of thorns. Right in here, he would have just put a little a circlet around his head. He would have put a loincloth on him. The Jews did bury they buried them nude, they buried them in just the shroud, but the scripture doesn't say Jesus was buried naked so that he could go to that and draw off of it. But definitely the man on the shroud is naked, and that would have been something that would have been in opposition to it being a devotional art form. Or forgeries only live up to the expectation of their audience. They never go beyond that to something that is superior. There's no reason to. There would be no reason for him to have an expensive cloth like what we would find with the shroud and the 3-to-1 herringbone weave and all of it. But it does fit what a rich man would buy, as Joseph of Arimathea did. I think a good example, I love the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. But
Yeah, it's
unfortunately,
fantastic. That's
yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
but unfortunately, they were fooled into buying what was presented to them as Dead Sea Scrolls that were available. And they bought them, and they looked genuine, and it was definitely written on old leather. But when you put that literally under the microscope, it didn't fit. And I didn't put this in any of my papers. I might put this up online, but in preparation for today, I took that as an example. And there are at least 6 different things that I found with that forgery, the Dead Sea Scroll forgery, that we don't have in contrast, I guess, a better contrast with the shroud itself. One is you had the Dead Sea Scroll forgeries that the Museum of the Bible purchased. You had cracks in the leather, and the ink went down into the cracks and went along the lines of the leather. So they couldn't see that with the naked eye, but under a microscope, they were saying, okay, look, this isn't real. Just the opposite happens with the shroud. As you know, when Stirp got there, they were thinking, okay, we're going to go in there, and in 5 minutes, we're going to show it's a painting. And after all these tests, they came back and said, it's not a painting. It's not a rubbing. It's not a scorch. It's not the work of an artist. We don't know how it got there, but here it is. And it's superficial. The image is superficial. That's in contrast to what we would find with forgeries, like with the Dead Sea Scroll forgeries. Those forgeries, the ink sat on top of contaminants with any age, dirt that was in the leather and all. Well, the ink was on top of that. Well, what do we find with the shroud? The image comes to where the blood is at, and then it stops. Lets you know that it's not underneath it. The blood was applied first, and which is what we would expect if the shroud is genuine. And so there's a good contrast between those two. So you have microscopic, where they go through and they look at it, and then you have contaminants, as opposed to how the shroud is. All the contaminants on the shroud speak for it. The type of pollen that's on there, the soil, and all this on there, and then through its line, as your book shows, and others, you get that story that where the shroud finally gets to France and then into Italy. But we find evidence all the way through the shroud and dirt and DNA and all that has been done since then. Then you have definitely the leather had been reused, and underneath it, well, this shroud hasn't been reused. It's high quality. Then you had fragments that in the forged fragments that show signs of deliberate artificial aging. Well, not so with the shroud. As I said, 5 different dating methods put it to about 2,000 years. The amount of vanillin and the tensile
Lignin,
strength
yeah,
and
yeah,
all of that.
yeah,
So it's just a good contrast if you look at how this forgery, although it's a written forgery, how it fooled some, but under examination, under scientific examination, it failed. You have the shroud, and under scientific examination, they still don't know.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that's what I love about your 30 points, and I really do like your point about comparing to the shoe leather. That's what the Dead Sea
Yeah,
Scrolls were from the Museum of the Bible, and I like the way that you compare the two, because that's like a it's a true forgery as opposed to a false forgery.
right,
It's an
right.
authentic thing versus a forged thing. And that's a great way to compare the two, and all of those points there make so much sense. I really appreciate that.
Well, on my site, on the one about, I think I called it For the Ages, um, why a medieval forgery theory fails, something like that. I have to look it up. It fails under scrutiny.
Right.
Um, the I conclude there. This is the apologist in me. Apologist we love syllogisms. When the moral argument, we put it in syllogism. An argument that William Lane Craig, when he does the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, 3 points. We like, and it's a good argument, because this is sound abductive argumentation. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And so after I listed, I think in that I only put about 5 or 6 examples of why it could not be what a forger would have to know, and why a forger would not put this stuff in their forgery. So I had premise 1, that successful historical forgeries are designed around the knowledge and experience of their intended audience.
Hmm.
You want to get it out to the people who are there, and it's only to them. Premise 2, the shroud contains multiple independent features that were inaccessible, unnecessary, and unintelligible to a medieval audience,
Hmm.
including microscopic superficiality, negative image, 3-dimensional encoding, and forensic blood sequencing. Uh, those things they would not know anything about, but we find that in the shroud. Premise 3, features that provide no persuasive advantage within their historical context are historically anomalous within the model of intended forgery. That's just a nice way of saying, if you introduce these things to an audience that doesn't need them, it's superfluous and it's counterproductive. So therefore, the conclusion, if those 3 things are true, the conclusion is the shroud does not fit well within the historical model of medieval forgery, and requires a different or more complex explanation. And so I think, you mentioned Russ earlier. In many of his talks, he's so plain spoken, and I appreciate it. He says, well, it's like this. It's either the burial cloth of Christ, or it's not. And it's either a forgery or it's not. if it's not a hoax and it's not a forgery and it's not a devotional work of art, that leaves an artifact.
Mm.
And I think we have, and I think, and I mentioned I'm an evangelical. I really want evangelicals to not close their minds to the scriptural evidence and the historical evidence for the shroud. I think it's something that we should embrace and study, and not come away with false conclusions. Like I had one guy write me and tell me that that the burial cloth of Christ had so much resin on it that it was like a cocoon. And my argument for the shroud was unbiblical. Well, I can read New Testament Greek. I can promise you, nowhere in the Greek New Testament does it say that the burial cloth of Christ was a cocoon. It doesn't say
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't say anything where in the New Testament that resin was used on the cloth. It's not there. But we do find burial practices consistent and everything with it, that if it, as you noted earlier, if this is not the burial cloth of Christ, then it's miraculous in and of itself.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that that is such a a good a great point, and I can't remember who I heard that from. I think it might have been Russ, and the first time, although it might have been Barry as well. But I think that there's like to your point, and in your paper here, there's like 20 or 30 different points that say the forger would have to know this, the forger would have had to have done this. And I like your premises. Now, you said you had three premises, or was it five premises, or how did that work?
I had three premises, and this is on the blog, "A Forger for the Ages: Why a Medieval Forgery Theory of the Shroud Fails Under Scrutiny."
Mm,
And although it's in color, but this is black and white. It looks like this when you go to it have that picture on it.
okay.
It's about the third or fourth one of the blogs down after the papers. Um, let me also add this note. I give a challenge, and I think this challenge goes for all Christians. Whether you're Orthodox, Catholic, evangelical, Protestant, whatever label, if you are trusting in Christ, but if you are skeptical of the shroud, I wrote a blog that I call it the Shroud Wager, and I'm playing a little bit off of Blaise Pascal, who had Pascal's wager, and his wager in a very loose sense. And he wasn't writing this formally. He put it in a paper that was part of his notes, and it didn't get published till after he died, and it wasn't all put together yet. It was just kind of more like outlined kind of thing. But basically, it said this: that if all things were equal, and God exists to God does not exist, what have you lost if you trust God? You have a sense of your guilt being gone. You have a sense and purpose in your life, and if you die, you haven't lost anything. But if you live your life as though there is no God, and you die and God is there, then you have lost everything. And
Hmm.
he wasn't saying it's 50-50. He said if it were 50-50. He gives several arguments on why it's not and why God does exist, and all. So I took that and I made a shroud wager. And this is not for the unbeliever because it would have no meaning for them. But for the believer, this is my wager. If the shroud turns out to be the most miraculous forgery of all time, what have you lost by looking at it and studying it? You have seen the crucifixion. You've seen what Jesus went through in his passion for us. You get an understanding of how burials were practiced in Jerusalem in a very limited time period and location. You get a sense of understanding. This is what the Son of God did for me. Just like if you go and you see the Passion of the Christ, or you see a movie, or The Chosen, or something along those lines, and you see what Christ has done, you've not lost anything. What if it's real? What if this really is the burial cloth of Christ, and you don't spend any time looking at it, studying it, seeking it out? Would you have done that for any other artifact? If we found we made Steven Spielberg made an entire series and is embedded in our minds, Indiana Jones and In Search of the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it appears in several other Indiana Jones movies as well. If we found the Ark of the Covenant, would we dismiss it? We would say, look, this proves the Bible. This shows what Scripture had. What if we find Noah's Ark? I know there's been some talk about that. I have my doubts about the formation that's there, but let's say we find Noah's Ark, and there's no doubt that that's Noah's Ark. What have we lost? I mean, we would be excited about those findings. Why is it when it comes to this cloth, we don't want to say this is something that it could be? And like I said, if it's true and we accept it, great. But if it's true and we don't, then we're kind of rejecting something that God's given us as a testimony to what He's done. And I think that we should take that wage and determine, search it out, study to seek. Scripture says, study to show yourself approved unto God.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny. You could take the argument even the same way and say, assume that the shroud is a forgery. Just like the movie, The Passion. The Passion movie is a forgery. It didn't happen that way, but it's not a
Right.
bad retelling of the story. And so then if you even said, and of course I don't believe this, but if you even said that the shroud was a forgery, but it was a study of the passion that he suffered for us, the scourging, the wounds in the hands and the wrists, the wounds in the side and the feet and the dust and everything. It's actually, you could study that as a forgery and say, I have learned a whole lot that really represents or reflects what we find in the Gospels, because the forger did an incredible, if it was a forgery, he did an incredible job
Right.
to retell the story of the Passion. And so even if it was forgery, you could say, "Wow, I learned a lot from this thing."
And I think there's also a good contrasting message. You see the horror of death, and yet you see the peace, solitude that the body shows, that's on that face. It's not any normal body in death is unpleasant, and we would turn away, especially as decay sets in. But this is one where He said, "It is finished," and you have victory. And I
Mm,
also think there are signs of resurrection in the cloth. Um, I've had skeptics, atheists tell me that, well, even if it wrapped the body of Christ, so what? It doesn't prove resurrection. No, it doesn't. It doesn't prove resurrection. What it does show is a body that has been scourged and crucified just like Christ, and with uniqueness that Christ had, with like the crown of thorns and all. And rigor mortis sets in, but no decay. If a body is placed in that shroud, in the Shroud of Turin, within a short period of time, I think it's under 30 or under 40 hours, around 36 hours, all of a sudden that body is gone.
right, right. Well, and with that, I hate to say it, we've got a break. I think we're going to have to do another session because you've got there's so many other things that that you can talk about. Now, now do you have a book out there? I think it's called Mere Christianity in the Digital Age. Tell us about that.
Mere Christianity for the Digital Age. Can Faith Survive the Internet? C.S. Lewis had a great impact on my life.
Yeah, yeah.
And when C.S. Lewis wrote Mere Christianity, he he actually it was part of a radio broadcast he did for the BBC during the Blitz, which I always find interesting. That during a time when England is facing despair and an attack from Germany, they turn to an apologist. Uh, and a Christian who gets on the radio. I mean, it's almost unheard of for something like that today. But he gave these talks, and so I asked myself, if C.S. Lewis were here today, what might he say to this generation, especially in the age of the internet, to the internet skeptics and to memes and to all. Now, I'm not C.S. Lewis, and am no C.S. Lewis, but I've been heavily influenced by him. And I mentioned that I used to make films for 25 years. I was a documentary filmmaker, faith-based films, made about 30 documentaries, and 3 of those were on C.S. Lewis. So I got to meet some of the leading Lewis scholars in America and interviewed them during that time. And so that had an influence on me. Matter of fact, one of them, Devin Brown, writes the foreword for the book. And then I look at it through a philosophical. I also quote Chesterton and others in there that had an impact on Lewis himself. And then some of the standard arguments that we apologists like to use, arguments for the resurrection, arguments for the reliability of Scripture, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument that the universe is so finely tuned, how the apostles died. I think that's important. We get a lot of
Hmm.
tradition in there, and I kind of go along with my friend Sean McDowell on this. That let's not overstate. Let's say this is the evidence we have for this one, and it's strong. But here's the evidence for this one, and it's not so strong. It's more tradition, and just be honest about it. But what cannot be denied is that all of the disciples were willing to suffer and were willing to die, and we find that in their testimony in the book of Acts.
Yeah, yeah. It is just amazing, and that you're so right. Why would you risk your life or sacrifice your life for a lie? It makes absolutely no sense. Well, we definitely have to break. Tom, this has been wonderful. Where can they find out more information about you and your blog?
Well, on my site, www.tomstheology.blog. So tomstheology.blog, that'll get you to my site. If you just type in Tom Dallis, and Dallas is IS at the end. It's Greek, so Teddy and I have something in common. My heritage is Greek. And I tell people, even though it's pronounced like the city, I'm an is, not an as. So it's not AS at the end, it's IS, and it's a good way to remember Tom Dallis, and you'll be able to find that way too.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Definitely thank you, Tom, and really interesting. And we're definitely going to have to do a couple of rounds on this. You've got some really interesting stuff, and I was fascinated by your different papers and whatever, and definitely want to speak more about that. But in any case, for the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos on this series of the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And if you like this video, please rate it with 5 stars. And Tom, again, thank you so much for being here today.
It was my privilege, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely, thank you.